Hello and welcome to the Contrary. I'm Bonnie Erbay. This week we speak with woman thought leader Jane Olmstead Rumsey. She's a researcher from Northwestern University. She's released a study showing how the COVID-19 virus may alter gender norms in society. Welcome, Jane. How are you?
I'm well, thanks.
So tell me first, I think you focused a lot on caregiving roles. Tell me how COVID-19 is changing those roles in jobs, in homes, however it is affecting society.
I think one of the most important aspects of this crisis in terms of gender equality is the childcare needs that families are facing now. So what we look at in the study is how did couples divide childcare responsibilities before the crisis? And to do that, we use survey data, asking couples who does how much childcare work. And what we find is that even among couples where both partners work, women tend to do a majority of the childcare work, around 60%. Um, and so if we expect those types of divisions of labor to continue during the pandemic when schools and daycares are closed, that implies a huge increase in the amount of time that women are going to have to spend taking care of kids. And this can affect women's labor supply decisions as well. So if couples reach a decision that basically the mother is going to take on the same proportion of childcare work as before, this in some cases is going to force women to leave their jobs, basically because there's just so many constraints on their time that they're not going to be able to both work and spend time homeschooling their kids and performing other tasks that need to be done at home.
So how do you think that will impact how couples share child care, caregiving, and elder caregiving? We all know women are not just the majority of caregivers for their children, but for their parents as well.
One aspect that we talk about and that we find quite interesting is in the paper we look at couples where the woman in the couple is an essential worker, say a doctor, but her husband is able to telecommute. So in those couples, we're going to see potentially a new division of childcare where kids are at home. The husband is able to telecommute or may have lost his job, unfortunately. And in those cases, men will see themselves becoming primary caregivers in some cases for the first time. And so this, in the long term, might actually have positive implications for gender equality because we know from studies about paternity leave that even small changes in men's involvement in childcare can actually have lasting implications for how much time they spend with their kids. So in those couples where men are spending more time, we argue that actually this could increase equality in the division of childcare and elder care in couples.
For quite some time, I don't know, a decade maybe, more men have been going into nursing. Women were almost exclusively nurses in this country. There were very few men, say 20 years ago, but as there developed a shortage of nurses, the pay went up, and some nurses now make what doctors are making when they're running a whole, floor of nurses in a big hospital or something. And so men started to creep into the nursing profession because the money became better than what they were doing before that. So will we see the same thing now, except on a larger scale? Will we see more men because they are caregiving at home and then their kids grow up and move out of the house and, oh, I can be a nurse now? I've had the experience. I mean, I have to go to school for it, obviously, or maybe they do that while the kids are in high school growing up. But will we see that happen in the nursing field? Will it soon be 50-50?
I think there's certainly a potential for kind of a learning by doing effect, right? The more caregiving that men do, the kind of more potential they feel in themselves to be able to do that type of work. We also cite some studies in our paper showing that boys who grew up with working mothers during World War II were more likely to marry women who wanted to work as well. And so the effect that kids get from seeing their fathers being more involved can also potentially have long-term implications for what types of jobs they're interested in doing.
I actually remember at the beginning of the dot-com bust. I was in San Francisco visiting one of my close friends, and we went out to Mill Valley for breakfast and coffee, and there was this wonderful coffee shop with a playground and park outside of it. And I noticed that there were, and this goes back several decades anyway, and I noticed that the parents taking care of the children were all men. And I said to my friend, wow, California, just like everything else, is way ahead of the rest of the country. You never go to a Washington playground and see all fathers taking care of their children, Washington, D.C., I mean, um, and or New York City or any of that. And he said, no, Bonnie, this is not California being ahead of the rest of the country. This is the dot-com bust. And the fathers lost their jobs and the mothers are still working. So had you heard about that? Did you know that there really was a boom of men providing care to their children years and years ago?
Yes, that's actually one thing we talk about in the paper. Past recessions have been what we call man sessions. So in previous financial crises, because of the sectors that men versus women tend to work in, men tend to work in more cyclical sectors like trade, transportation, manufacturing. But this crisis is likely to be quite different. So another aspect of this crisis for gender equality is just the fact that women are now more likely to lose their jobs during this crisis, according to very recent data that's coming in, than men are. So in past crises, maybe men were spending more time with their kids, as you say. But in this one, it's more likely mothers that are going to be losing their jobs.
Healthcare jobs, women are predominantly are fill more healthcare jobs, of course, mostly at the lower echelon than do men, and yet they're losing their jobs during this COVID-19 crisis. Please explain to me how that works.
We're seeing that actually a big decline in GDP is due to a reduction in healthcare spending by consumers. Despite this public health crisis, actually, many people are canceling elective surgeries and other medical procedures that can be delayed. And so the healthcare sector is actually suffering some of the biggest layoffs of any sector.
But elaborate on that for me if you could, because one would think just by watching the news that that women being the most of the healthcare providers, that because of COVID-19, because of what's going on in the emergency rooms and filling hospital beds, that a lot of that would be made up for, but no. And doctors, by the way, I've seen two doctors now um, by computer. So doctors are switching their private practice appointments to computer anyway. So I haven't canceled any visits. I'm just doing them virtually.
Yeah, my understanding is that hospitals make a lot of their money doing these big surgeries, elective surgeries, and so it kind of depends where the big money makers are for the healthcare sector, and those tend to be things where you have to physically be there. So your routine appointments can go on, but when hospitals are thinking about their budgeting, they're really paying attention to these big procedures that people are canceling now or delaying.
How can first responders be protected in all this? And we know that women are creeping up when it comes to equality among doctors. Women still predominate among nurses. What about emergency medical care? Where are women and people of color in that field, and how is COVID changing gender norms in that field?
I am aware that people of color are overrepresented for sure in those occupations. Um, and I think it's just important for policymakers to, listen to workers about what they need.
You mentioned that there's future research in your study about the rise in domestic violence, but what does the study show so far when it comes to the likelihood among men and women?
Interestingly enough, one of my colleagues on the study has shown that domestic violence tends to rise in recessions and is related to men's unemployment. So when men feel frustrated and face job loss, that can increase the risk of domestic violence in the home. And we expect that that will be much worse in this crisis. Although policymakers are taking steps to, for example, provide hotel rooms for survivors to use and access when they face those situations. But we are very concerned about the risk of domestic violence. And when you read about what's the data on domestic violence during this crisis so far, it's clear that around the world there's been a huge uptick in calls for domestic violence incidents.
Thank you. And what's this going to do to the movement for paid family leave and medical leave? It's already been going on in this country for some 20 years. I've heard the data so many times that we fall way behind Europe and most of the rest of the developed countries, and even a lot of non-developed countries, in terms of paying parents for to take a break and stay at home with their children when they're first born, et cetera, or a very sick elderly parent. What's that going to do to that movement here?
Well, I hope that this crisis will highlight this shortcoming of US policymaking, the lack of paid family leave in the United States. We know that job losses, especially during recessions, can have very long lasting and severe consequences for people. And many of the job losses in this crisis will be due to the fact that people had no flexibility to take some time off. California has taken interesting steps to provide some paid family leave for people caring for their children, but they're one of the few states to do so. And the CARES Act, which was one of the stimulus bills that was passed, included family leave, but that leave was unpaid. And so, in many cases, that's not really going to be sufficient for people. So, I think one potential kind of silver lining of this crisis might be to highlight the importance of these employee-employer links that we can preserve through paid family leave policies during crises like this one.
Has the COVID-19 pandemic had an effect on jobs? Meaning, for example, are there categories of workers who weren't considered essential before the pandemic but are considered essential now?
Yes, for example, grocery store workers, it's become clear that those workers play an important role in all of our lives. But also going back along the food supply chain, back to meat packing workers, agricultural workers, we're realizing that these workers are absolutely essential to all of us. And then, of course, healthcare workers is the other main category that we're realizing just how essential they are.
But other than doctors and nurses and physicians assistants who are overall are well paid, a lot of the healthcare jobs you're talking about, as well as, for example, meat packing, they're minimum wage. So how do you protect those workers? Do you really think companies are going to be willing to pay for family and medical leave for these people when they can get them on a gig basis, meaning paid by the hour, paid by the day, no benefits?
We're hoping that the crisis sheds light on how essential these workers are and how important it is to protect them. One aspect that can be useful is if other companies, maybe with higher paid employees, extend those types of benefits. That can create a competitive environment among firms trying to attract workers, where then firms enter into competition with each other and start providing those benefits kind of as a baseline.
But how realistic do you think that is?
We're a long way from that, but I think we're the closest that we've ever been in a sense, because again, this crisis has really illuminated the importance of these workers.
Are there other ways than family and medical leave to protect women and people of color who are the most vulnerable to being let go, or even if they have some unpaid leave, losing their jobs if they try to take it? Or is anything else going on at that level, aside from just trying to get paid family and medical leave? Is Congress or are activists on this issue trying to get other protections for low-income workers?
The other system that's in place right now to help those sorts of workers, if they are to lose their job, is kind of the social safety net, unemployment insurance. So there, it's been very encouraging to see, for example, gig workers and self-employed people being included in the unemployment insurance system for the first time. Beyond that, we discuss in the paper how important it is to remove requirements from social assistance programs that recipients be searching for work, because many parents can't search for work right now when they're unemployed because they're providing childcare. And so accounting for those types of situations, family situations, is extremely important in the design of public policy.
I believe in toto there are now 18 states that have some form of paid family leave, usually dipping into reserves from the unemployment funds that have built up. But what do you see happening now? I mean, aren't all the unemployment funds going to go for actual unemployment claims, because unemployment is as high as it's been and higher than the last recession, the 2008 recession?
Yes, that's a great point. And state and local budgets are stretched extremely thin right now. So federal assistance for states to top up those unemployment insurance funds is very important. Um, Beyond that, I think there are other programs that can be implemented to supplement that paid family leave program. So other countries like Germany and Denmark provide direct subsidies to firms to keep people on their payroll, which is another way of basically offering paid family leave. So in Germany and Denmark, for example, they allow people to substantially reduce their hours down to maybe 10% of what they were doing before, and the government will give a subsidy to the firm. So that would be maybe a different pot of money than the unemployment insurance money.
There's always talk about the Western European countries and how great most of them, their family and medical leave paid family and medical leave systems are. How do they do it? Are taxes higher there than they are here?
Taxes there are significantly higher, both on firms and on individuals.
Why are people okay with that here? And a lot of Americans would not be okay with that.
That's right. I think in the short run, it would be very hard to raise taxes, especially in an economic environment that we're in right now. And so another option is to borrow, and interest rates are at historic lows right now. So borrowing is pretty easy for the federal government right now. And then I guess to raise taxes in the future is kind of the way that governments are thinking about this right now.
Now, I did want to get back to one point in your study, which was that the study claims this crisis has the potential to reduce gender inequality due to so many women being among the first responders. I know we touched a little on that before, but can you answer that specific question for me, please?
Yes. So we think that one aspect of this crisis that is kind of a silver lining is that it may bring about more flexible work arrangements for many people, and employers will begin to understand the childcare needs of their employees. So I think a common experience for many people these days is to be on a Zoom call or a Skype call and see a kid running around in the background. And so for many bosses, they're seeing their employees' kids for the first time and kind of understanding the need to be a bit flexible when people say, oh, I need to spend an hour with my kids during the workday. Can I make it up later? And so we're hoping that, especially for these essential workers, that some more flexibility is going to be offered in the future.
What kind of jobs that haven't been offered flexibility up till this crisis are going to are in a position to offer more of it? We have already seen, for example, it's pretty common among lawyers for example, to do a lot of work from home. Jobs with a lot of travel maybe won't have so much travel in the future because meetings can be done virtually.
So there's an economist at Harvard, Claudia Golden. She has work arguing that some of the remaining sectors with the biggest gender wage gaps are these legal and business and financial services industries. So lawyers do a lot of work from home, but they also have high face time requirements. So in the past, they've really been required to come into the office and do their work. And you're kind of rewarded for the greater time you spend in the office, the greater your chance of getting promoted. And so that has really held women back, women who need to maybe go and pick up their kids, or pick up elderly parents, do some caregiving during the day. But we're seeing now that a lot of work can be done from home, and these FaceTime requirements can be fulfilled in video calls at times that work for both participants. So we're hoping that in that aspect we can close the gender wage gap, at least partially because of this crisis, offering people greater flexibility.
Now, in terms of technology, what technology do you see will be necessary to accommodate this? Are we going to have to have a much greater bandwidth that go so people can meet virtually who have been meeting in person in the past? Is the nation going to have to build up its 5G system, which is faster and better, at a much more rapid pace than it has been doing so far?
Yes, that's right. And I think uh, some of these issues that we're talking about, the gender gap in these legal and financial occupations, really applies to the high income part of the distribution. And we worry actually a little bit more when it comes to parenting about access to technology at the lower part of the income distribution. So, how are kids going to be accessing homeschooling if they don't have sufficient internet access? So, in both cases, I think the answer is kind of making sure everyone has good, high quality internet and can communicate with the people that they need to communicate with.
And equipment, good laptops, good cell phones, good whatever it is
Tablets.
that you need. I mean, is
Yeah.
that going to become a federal responsibility to pay for that for low income women and women of color?
We see, for example, I'm in Chicago, and Chicago Public Schools has been handing out tablets and laptops to its students. So I think this is tending to be at the municipal and school district level, but uh, there is definitely a responsibility of public schools to make sure that everyone has access. And so public schools seem to be taking it upon themselves to provide that type of access. I'm not aware of federal programs related to that.
Please tell me what in the study do you want to talk about that I haven't asked you about yet?
Oh, one thing I want to talk about is what types of people can telecommute. So we look in the study at a survey asking people um, in different occupations whether they're able to telecommute, and there's a couple interesting findings there. So one is that overall men are more likely to be able to telecommute than women. And so that's another factor suggesting that women are more at risk of losing their jobs, because in general, if people can telecommute, they're probably going to be able to keep their jobs, at least in the short term. But the other really interesting finding was that single parents, both single men and single women, are less likely to be able to telecommute. And so this really highlights a key finding in our report, which is that single parents are really, really at risk in this crisis because they have no one to share childcare responsibilities with. And they're also really at a greater risk of losing their jobs. One fact we know about people who are losing their jobs so far is that they tend to be lower income. And these tend to be single parents. So we're quite concerned about that. And this is a new finding in our report, basically about characteristics of occupations that can telecommute.
But how can you change that? I mean, certain jobs you just can't telecommute. For example, if you're a janitor and you're cleaning floors, you can't do that remotely. So, how, what's the answer to that? Do you have to get people who are doing that now better educated so they don't have to do those jobs? Then again, who is going to do those jobs?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's not an option that's available to everyone. But I think there are some kind of marginal cases where maybe the work can be done at home, but it just hasn't in the past.
Do you have
Many
any
kind of
examples of that?
many kind of administrative type of jobs. So like an office assistant, maybe some of those responsibilities can really be done from home. Some maybe not, but I think we're kind of looking at what a job is in a new way, and maybe some parts of a job can be done at home, so people can spend maybe a couple of days a week at home, and that gives them greater flexibility to manage other responsibilities that they have in their family.
Okay, and I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball, and your ball may be pretty hazy, or maybe you don't have one today. But do you see ways in which the COVID 19 pandemic is going to change how women and men work in America forever?
I think it definitely will. Businesses are adopting, these sorts of technologies that allow people to work from home at a rapid scale, much faster pace than we've ever seen before. And I think that's going to have lasting effects on where people perform their jobs. Many more jobs will, I think, be done at home. And in many cases, we see that when people have the option to telecommute, they choose to do that. So that's one aspect. Um, as we said, I think another aspect is kind of understanding what are the essential occupations in the workforce, and maybe some policy changes to our social safety net that will support those occupations as well.
Thank you so much, Jane Olmstead Rumsey. You're a researcher from Northwestern University, having co-authored a study on how COVID-19 is changing gender norms in the United States and in the workplace. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you all for watching. That's it for this edition. Please be sure to visit our website at pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next week.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Frueauff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more. PBS.